And Britain strikes a historic deal to join a major Trans-Pacific Free Trade Pact after nearly 2 years of negotiations. It's the first European nation to join the CPTPP, the UK's biggest trade deal since Brexit.
Now, for more details on the deal, let's speak with Deborah Elms. She's Executive Director of Asian Trade Centre, and she joins us live from right here in Singapore. Good evening, Ms. Elms. Thanks for joining us today. It's taken the UK about less than 2 years, in fact, to join this pact. It's the first European nation to do so. They've said it's about the economy, about growing it, not just for now, but in the future as well. But based on the government's own estimates, it's not going to raise domestic GDP all that much, 0.08%. That's the government's estimate. That's not a lot. So what's the rationale for this deal if the gains barely offset the European trade losses that Britain's seen since Brexit?
Well, I think that you should take some of those estimates with a grain of salt. I mean, in particular, usually how you estimate those is you say, let me take today's current trade flows and then project it forward. But oftentimes, if you don't have any trade at all, then when you project it forward, of course, the gains look extremely modest. And because the UK is far from many of the CPTPP countries, you can imagine there's not currently a lot of trade. But in the future, especially as the trade barriers fall to UK exports, there might be a lot more trade than the estimates suggest. That's the first thing. And then the second thing I would point out is that almost all of these estimates ignore or really downplay the role of services trade and investment. And for the UK in particular, services and investment is far more important to their overall economic growth and future than trade and goods has been. So I think that the numbers, while they look extremely small right now, are likely to be bigger than that. So that's the first point. The numbers themselves, I think, are small. But the second big point I would say is that if you are looking to the future, you need to be tied into the fastest growing part of the global economy. And I think for the UK, this was an opportunity for them to have a seat at the table of making rules for the future and to be hooked into Asia, where, frankly, everything seems to be happening.
Well, the sentiments of Kemi Badenoch, the UK's Trade Secretary, echo what you've said, Ms. Elms, because she mentioned the fact that the full potential was not yet known as to how the United Kingdom would benefit from CPTPP, that it could be much bigger, and particularly if China were to join, because China also has lined up to do so. We don't know if it will actually get that, but it certainly is trying. Do you think here that there is this quotient value as well as to deepening ties, as you said, to sort of outreach to Asian markets?
I think that that's absolutely critical, especially when you are the UK and you have severed ties from the largest set of economies closest to you. We know that in general in trade, you trade more often with people who are closer to you physically, geographically closer, partly because you're just more familiar. You tend to have more relationships with people who are closer to you than those who are halfway around the world, and it's just easier. It's also easier, of course, for trade and goods, where the logistics costs are usually less if you're right next door than if you're halfway around the world. So it's a little, again, it's difficult to imagine how you might make up for the loss of the European Union if you're the UK. But when you look around the world at alternatives, I would say CPTPP is a particularly good one for the UK because although it can't replace the EU, certainly not in the near term, it provides you access to 11 other markets that are, as I just mentioned, in an important part of the world, including here in Singapore. And I think that is a value all on its own, regardless of whatever the mathematical modeling may or may not suggest.
Mm. Do you think that the UK's participation in that regard, Ms. Elms, is somehow going to be able to shape the future context for other members of this pact?
Well, it certainly gives them a seat at the table, particularly as we're looking ahead towards future accession. And as you noted, we have a couple of other economies that have already put their hand up, most notably China, but also Taiwan, Uruguay and Costa Rica. In fact, a number of Latin American countries have been enthusiastic about joining the CPTPP at this time. So once the UK becomes a full member, which is very, very soon now, then they will have a seat at that table discussing accession and receiving benefits from being part of this larger agreement. And I think that also cannot be discounted. If we have significant challenges on the global trade front, which we have had and we have seen for a while, then being able to tie yourself into a large, deep, and ambitious trade agreement lowers the risks and increases certainty for your own companies. But it also does the same thing, I would argue, for Singapore-based companies or CPTPP-based companies looking back to the UK. It provides you with another important market with new access and new opportunities. And anytime you have a regional agreement, it tends to be easier for companies to use than bilateral arrangements. So I think it's a win for the UK. It's certainly a win for the CPTPP. And I'd like to think it's a win for the global economy because it shows that there is still enthusiasm for economic integration and for future market access.
Ms. Elms, do you think it's going to give an edge to the United Kingdom over the EU, notably no EU member country in the CPTPP? Does it give the UK an edge in terms of positioning itself with its relations, its ties with the Indo-Pacific countries?
That's an interesting question. I would have to think a little harder about it. I think certainly for UK companies, some of them may have better benefits, especially vis-a-vis EU, which has a lot of trade agreements in this region, but does not yet have a trade agreement, for example, with Malaysia, which is a CPTPP member. And the regional agreements can still be easier to use. Certainly from the perspective of like a Vietnam trying to do trade, it's easier to use CPTPP or the EU-Vietnam agreement than it might be for a bilateral agreement between Vietnam and the UK. So I think that the picture is a little bit more mixed. The European Union could, you never know, could find it more interesting to become a CPTPP member in the future, now that the explicit link to the Trans-Pacific part has been broken and that it's clear that there's an appetite for adding in new kinds of members. I think you can never say never on these things. So maybe we would see the EU joining TPP at some point in the future.
And the United States still notably out. Deborah, thank you very much for that. Deborah Elms, the Executive Director of Asian Trade Centre, speaking to us from right here in Singapore.